Hi, I'm Ian Darnell, Assistant Curator for LGBTQIA+ collections at the Missouri Historical Society. We are here today at the Missouri History Museum, and I'm going to give you a tour of Gateway to Pride, the Missouri History Museum's first ever in-depth exploration of St. Louis's LGBTQIA+ history. Before we go on, I wanted to take a second to consider this banner hanging in the Grand Hall of the Missouri History Museum. It's what visitors first see as they're about to enter the exhibit. Now, we put a lot of thought into this banner and what it should look like, because we assume that many visitors might have questions about whether or not they wanted to go to an exhibit like this one. But we decided our approach should be this, to focus on faces. So this banner is filled with faces of people whose stories appear in the exhibit. Now, what I love about that is that it shows that this history is personal and that it's about real, unique people's stories. It moves past stereotypes. And the other thing that I love about this selection of faces is how diverse it is. We have faces from the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. We have men and women and non-binary people, transgender and cisgender people, gay men, lesbians, and bi people, and people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds, as well as people who were in the military, artists, business people, religious leaders, artists, and more. So that, I think, gets at the incredible diversity and complexity of the LGBTQIA+ community in St. Louis, and also all of the ways that LGBTQIA+ lives have been stitched into every other aspect of life in our region.
Hi, I'm Sharon Smith, Curator of Civic and Personal Identity at the Missouri Historical Society, and one of the curators who was responsible for this exhibit and actually the one who spearheaded the Gateway to Pride initiative. We began thinking about this exhibit in 2014, but previously, MHS had very few things in the collection that had to do with Gateway to Pride or the LGBTQIA+ community. And so it was really important that at some point we would start to collect things that had to do with this community. We met Stephen Brawley, and it was a great meeting. He had a whole lot of things that he had collected on behalf of the St. Louis LGBT History Project. One of the things that we were able to do was partner with him to get a whole lot of that collection into our collection, but also he introduced us to many people who would be important in telling the stories of both the community, but also about artifacts and objects that they had. And so it really became a labor of love for all of us to connect. He also introduced us to Ian Darnell. Ian Darnell joined the staff in 2019, and with Ian's help, we brought this exhibit to life in a major way, and we're able to tell all of those stories and many more in this groundbreaking exhibit.
I think what's so exciting about this exhibit is that it weaves LGBTQIA+ stories into the entire history of the St. Louis area, from St. Louis's early history in the 18th century all the way up almost to the present day. And the exhibit's logo and our intro panel really speak to that idea. Something that you'll see throughout the exhibit in graphics and other places is this idea of weaving, sort of putting together a tapestry. And that sort of reflects the idea that St. Louis's LGBTQIA+ history is sort of a tapestry of many stories coming together, and something that's also woven into the larger fabric of St. Louis's past. So this intro panel is supposed to get at that idea with these intersecting ribbons. And then if you look closely, each of these ribbons is embedded with an image of an artifact or a document or a photograph that will appear elsewhere in that exhibit, getting at that idea of stitched together stories. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how the exhibit is organized and some key features that you'll need to navigate the exhibit. So, first of all, we knew that there was going to be some especially sensitive content. Things that maybe people would want to take some consideration before they saw and experienced. Things that have to do with, say, sex, violence, traumatic moments in the community's history. So we thought a lot about how to deal with that, and what we settled on is having these please note labels. So sections that are particularly sensitive are sort of set aside from the rest of the exhibit, and we have this label, please note, that has a brief explanation of what is in that section, and we give visitors an opportunity to decide for themselves whether they want to experience it. Another feature of the exhibit is this LGBTQIA plus voices icon. So this appears throughout the exhibit, at least in the later chronological sections. So part of the Gateway to Pride initiative was recording oral history interviews. Those were interviews with people who witnessed and experienced and shaped the history that we talk about in the exhibit. So we ended up creating a huge archive of oral histories, more than 30 interviews, each about 2 hours long. And we had to decide how to feature those in the exhibit. So oral history clips appear in a couple of places, in the intro video here in the introduction of the exhibit, and in a video monitor that shares clips from interviews with people talking about their identities and what those identities mean to them. But we also have these QR clips. So you could use your smartphone or other device to scan these QR codes, and that will take you to a YouTube video with a clip from an oral history interview. And in those, an interviewee might be talking about an artifact that they donated, or their personal perspective on some important historical event, or otherwise enrich the visitor's experience as they explore the exhibit. Okay, let's start exploring the exhibit. Most of the exhibit is arranged chronologically, so as you move through the exhibit, you're also moving through time, surveying all of St. Louis's history through the lens of the LGBTQIA+ experience. But this first section of the exhibit isn't chronological. Instead, it introduces key themes and ideas that you need for understanding this history. And at the very beginning is this intro video. It's composed of clips from oral history interviews and historical images, and it sets the stage for the rest of the exhibit.
I was inspired to begin the St. Louis LGBT History Project on the simple basis of elders in the community who I knew were passing away, including my friend Betty Davis, who was a well-known drag performer in St. Louis. And I remembered the stories they told, and I remembered thinking in real time, wow, these stories are so amazing, something should be done to document and preserve them.
Queer people and trans people have always been part of American history.
You get a quick sense that there's been a long history of queer community here, right?
We have always been here, and we have done a lot for this city.
If I've learned anything in life, silence equals death. The mantra, the slogan, the t-shirt from ACT UP, from the AIDS crisis. Silence equals death.
St. Louis has its legacy and reputation of being a very racially divided community, and that a big piece of what the challenge for us in our community was to have relationships, friendships, businesses, communities that reflected the diversity of our community.
Back in my time, you wouldn't want to be gay. You know, if you had any way not to be gay, you wouldn't, because of what you go through, what you went through.
When I first came out, which was around 1980 or so, I really thought that to be a lesbian, you had to lead a double life.
The idea of gay marriage or gay people having kids wasn't even a thought in my mind when I was growing up in St. Louis.
But we've always been resilient. We've been a resilient community, and we resist things, and we always make a way to make it work and move forward.
And decriminalizing homosexuality was only the first step. It was the first step in being able to say, we are full members of the society.
It was a scary time, but it was an exciting time, because the more you studied, the more you learned, the stronger you felt, you know, that something really needed to change. And I think St. Louis it was just a great place to do it.
People's minds have changed and found out that we're human beings.
Obviously, it's much easier now to be who you want to be.
I think that people have become more accepting in society about women who love women, men who love men.
Gays and lesbians stood up and said, we need to be counted as well. We're not going to stay in the closets. There are no longer closets big enough for you to keep us in.
On one hand, it's exciting to uncover the history. On the other hand, it's very sad that many of these histories are forever lost. We'll never be able to capture them.
From Sylvia Rivera to Marsha P. Johnson, to all of the unknown and unnamed trans women of color that were a part of spearheading the movement for gay liberation and queer liberation.
All the people who are out there doing something, has all paved the way for something better today.
We the foundation, so as we continue to build on the foundation, the importance of us having our history be told is so that the next generation could know that they can just add to that.
Well, I certainly credit the activists of the early post-Stonewall movement. The movement was to show that we are in your family, that we are in your church, that we are in your school, that we're in your business. And so where putting a face and a name to the identity became sort of an act of revolution.
These folks who came before us, they're not famous, but they're just monumental. They are our forebears. They are us.
There were people before me that laid a lot of sidewalks for me to walk on, just as I have done for people that are walking the streets and walking that same path today.
I was in community and spaces with queer poets and queer artists, queer punk kids, queer DIY kids, queer activists, queer elders. That's one of the cool things about St. Louis is that the queer community is very diverse.
St. Louis is a place in which I can not have purpose, in which I feel I have purpose to stay and fight.
I believe that St. Louis needs people like us in it, for sure. We enhance the city in so many ways.
You can kind of feel the energy of, at least in my mind, of people who really want to change the world.
It's important for the current generation to understand how bad things were in the not so distant past. And I hope that visitors who see our history might take away what we've been through and that we're just like everyone else, but we've maybe had a rougher road.
The exhibit serves as an educational teaching moment for the overall community to learn about the LGBTQIA+ family, our history, the trials and tribulations it's been through, but also for the members of the community to learn new information, new stories that they did not know about, to see themselves included, their family, their chosen family, their friends, their networks, to see their lives and their journeys amplified.
The rest of the first section of the exhibit introduces visitors to key ideas for understanding sexuality and gender, both today and in the past. This area here talks about sexuality and gender in historical perspective, and we bring those ideas to life with some amazing artifacts like a packet of condoms that was found in a World War II sailor's cap and a natural family planning calendar from the 1950s. This infographic is a way to communicate key ideas about gender and sexual diversity. And we even have a section with historical terms that explain how people talked about those identities in the past. As we continue, there's a series of 4 profiles that show how sexual and gender identities play out in real 21st century St. Louisans' lives. We profile Catherine Bone Hunt, a lesbian feminist, Robin Montague, a transgender woman, Craig Green, a fabulous local nightlife icon, and Chris Worth, a bisexual artist with a disability. There's also a small panel explaining how we use pronouns in the exhibit, and an oral history monitor, where St. Louisans talk about their identities and what they mean to them. And then finally, we have an interactive station, where visitors are invited to share their own identities on slips of paper. And we display a rotating selection of those responses here. We've received thousands of responses, and it's a fascinating glimpse at how St. Louisans today think about gender and sexuality. So we've left the introductory section of the exhibit, and now we're getting into the meat of things. There are 3 chronological sections in the exhibit. The first one is called Emerging Identities and Communities and covers St. Louis's early history up to the mid-20th century. The second chronological section, The Rise of a Movement, is about the second half of the 20th century, and the final chronological section, Equality, ? Is about the 21st century. But here we are at the start of the first chronological section, Emerging Identities and Communities. So this is all about St. Louis in an era when it transitioned from being a tiny frontier village to one of America's great metropolises, an era of rapid urbanization and industrialization and dramatic social change. This was also the time when what we now understand as LGBTQI+ identities were beginning to form and communities were coming together in the context of this dynamic American city. So we begin this first chronological section with a panel on the cultural bedrock, the heritage of understanding gender and sexuality that serves as the basis for understanding all of the history that follows. We talk about the distinctive contributions of Black St. Louisans, European settlers and immigrants, and also indigenous people. We also talk about the concept of mihoga. That's an idea from Osage culture referring to people who are neither male nor female, but a third gender. That reflects an idea in many indigenous societies that human beings couldn't always be categorized as male or female. Also in this discussion of St. Louis's early history, we tell the story of Harriet Hosmer. Harriet was a sculptor, a female sculptor, which was an extraordinary occupation for women in the 19th century. She was also a woman who loved women and in many ways was considered masculine by the standards of her day. So while it's difficult to apply a modern lens to understanding her identity, she's clearly a forebearer of the LGBTQIA+ community of today. Here we have a photograph of Harriet posing next to her monumental sculpture of Thomas Hart Benton, which today stands in Lafayette Park in St. Louis. And on loan from the St. Louis Art Museum, we have her spectacular marble sculpture, Zenobia in Chains, which for her was an allegory of women's oppression in the world that she inhabited in the 19th century. Finally, there's a tactile element in the exhibit. This is a 3D printer recreation of Zenobia in Chains that visitors are invited to touch for themselves. This area of the exhibit is called Sinful Criminal. It traces the development of negative attitudes towards gender and sexual difference in the early history of St. Louis. These include religious attitudes that considered sexual difference sinful, laws that made it illegal to have sex with someone of the same sex or to dress in the clothes of the opposite sex, and an emerging psychiatric science that considered homosexuality and gender transgression mental illnesses. These would have a profound effect on St. Louis's LGBTQIA+ history and kept an emerging LGBTQIA+ community in the shadows. For me, this is perhaps the most fascinating part of the exhibit. It's where we tell the story of Claude Hartland. So, at the heart of this section of the exhibit is a book. A simple book published in 1901 titled The Story of a Life. That book is the earliest autobiographical account we have of an LGBTQIA+ St. Louisan. It was written by someone using the pseudonym Claude Hartland. Claude grew up in the rural South and from an early age recognized his attraction to men. He also said that he experimented with wearing his sister's clothes and would have worn women's clothes all the time if he could. Then, at the very start of the 20th century, as a young man, he decided to leave his home and move to the big city of St. Louis, at the time the 4th largest city in the country. Here, he discovered people who were like him, and even met friends and lovers on the streets of St. Louis. And he describes all of that in this extraordinary memoir. Now, copies of this book, or first edition copies at least, are extremely rare. So we had to borrow one of those rare copies from the University of Kentucky's Medical Library, and it's on display here. But to bring the book to life, we also created a media piece with a modern voice actor reading excerpts of Claude's story paired with historical images. We also worked with a St. Louis-based painter, Hilaire Cheatham, to create a portrait of Claude. Unfortunately, we don't have any photographs of Claude, but we found clues in the text and also did research in contemporary fashion, and we worked with the painter to envision what Claude might have looked like. So we at least have an idea of what Claude might have looked like when he wrote his extraordinary memoir.
In the following chapters appears the history of a being who has the beard and the well-developed sexual organs of a man, but who is, from almost every other point of view, a woman. He has the delicate, refined tastes of a woman, and what is worse, her sexual desires for men. Physically, he is a strange combination of male and female. He has the hands, arms, and waist of a woman, while his shoulders, hips, lower limbs, and feet are those of a man. All his natural inclinations are effeminate, and he has never felt one thrill of sexual desire for a female. In this little volume, he offers to the medical world the strange story of his own life, hoping that it may be a means by which other similar sufferers may be reached and relieved. I was 11 years old when a new and stronger desire than I had hitherto felt took possession of me, a desire to dress in female attire. Being unable to see the evil results, I followed this new inclination to the last extreme. Whenever I had the time to spare, I would steal off to my sister's apartments, and donning her best gown, would walk up and down the room for hours, holding up my skirts and putting on all sorts of effeminate airs. Not being satisfied with my sister's clothes, I begged old skirts of hers, which I cut and made into garments of my own. Hats and dresses of all kinds were made and worn with greatest pride, and when thus attired, I felt that I was in my natural element. I felt not shame at being seen in female attire, and would have worn it all the time had I been allowed. My features, form, voice, and tastes were those of a female, and I felt out of place in boys' clothes. I found myself in front of a ticket office. I entered, determined to go somewhere. I did not care where. New Orleans, Cincinnati, and St. Louis came into my mind. But having no choice, I asked the ticket agent what a ticket was worth to St. Louis, at the same time handing him $20. He gave me a ticket and my change, and on November 11th, 1899, I landed in this city for the first time. I spent 2 weeks in seeing the sights and familiarizing myself with the city in general. I did not like St. Louis at all, but made up my mind to spend the winter anyway, and began to look about for employment. I had never done anything but teach, and being a perfect stranger, I did not know how to go about finding work. I was not fitted for manual labor of any sort, and while walking about the streets wondering what to do, a sign, "Ladies Tailoring," on a window caught my attention. I knew that I had not forgotten how to sew, so I boldly entered and asked for work. It was during the busy season, and help being very scarce, I was taken on 1 half-day's trial, at the end of which time I was employed. Soon after this, I met a young man one evening on the corner of 6th and Olive Streets, who was affected as I am, and we knew each other at sight. I spent the night at his house, and we had a most delightful time. He was gentle, refined, and very interesting, and we soon became fast friends. Our sexual relations ceased at once, and genuine brotherly affection is the only tie that binds us now. He looks upon his disease as a great misfortune, of course, but has long since learned to bow in submission to the inevitable, and now worries but little on its account. He has been a great source of comfort to me, and I shall always remember his kindness and brotherly advice. I went to the theater almost every night, and being very busy during the day, I had but little time to brood over my own condition. One Sunday evening, while seated in the Columbia Theater watching the show, a man came in and took a seat beside me. He was very handsome, and had a sweet, fascinating face, yet I could see that he had been drinking heavily. He soon began a conversation with me, and I found his voice as sweet and interesting as his face. We continued in conversation, and when the show was over, we were not far from being in love with each other. He gave me his name and address, and asked me to call and see him. My life was so dark and sinful that I prayed to die. I continued to pray for relief, but I had no further faith. I went to a physician who was said to be very fine, but he never heard of a case like mine. Dear reader, open your eyes to these dreadful facts. Dream no longer that they are mythical tales that have drifted from Grecian shores. Such sufferers are all around you. You worship with them in church, you meet with them at your lodges and clubs, you talk to them on the streets. Learn to know them, do not spurn them, seek to save them, for they have souls that feel and suffer.
Many people are surprised to learn that it was illegal in the city of St. Louis from the 1840s until the 1980s to wear the clothes of the opposite sex. This was a tremendous burden on the lives of both St. Louisans that we would think of today as transgender and the city's drag artists. In this part of the exhibit, we bring to life two St. Louisans we would think of today as transgender who lived in the 19th century. We know their stories because they were arrested for violating the so-called masquerading ordinance against wearing the clothes of the opposite sex, and their stories were reported on in local newspapers. Unfortunately, we didn't have artifacts that spoke directly to their stories, so we turned to displaying historically accurate recreations of the clothes that they were wearing when they were arrested. We talk about Florence Smith, who was a black trans woman who was repeatedly arrested for violating the masquerading ordinance in downtown St. Louis in the 1870s and 1880s. She appeared in court once wearing a red satin dress, much like this one, to answer to charges of masquerading. Meanwhile, we also have a natty brown suit. A German immigrant named John Berger was wearing something like this when he was arrested for masquerading. After his arrival in St. Louis, he had begun living as a man. This corner of the exhibit deals with the 1930s, a time of a surprisingly vibrant and visible queer subculture in St. Louis. For example, there was a very rich local drag scene. People flocked to performances by female impersonators in clubs like Julia Ann's, The Red Dragon, and Mabel Thorpe's Cocktail Lounge. And this is an image of Mabel Thorpe's Cocktail Lounge. This is a photograph of Mabel Thorpe and some of the female impersonation performers who were at her nightclub. A few things that I love to point out about this 1936 photograph. For one thing, while drag shows today typically feature lip syncing, that wasn't so technologically feasible in the 1930s. So instead we have a pianist providing live music, and these queens would use their own voices to sing during performances. Then we also have this person here. This was a pansy. That's sort of a stock character who appeared in many female impersonation performances of the era. You can see that he has makeup on and a flowing silky shirt, and he would have sort of served as an MC during these performances. So Mabel Thorpe's nightclub was often packed in the 1930s, but it also drew the attention of neighbors who objected to the undesirable people who congregated there, and some people also pointed out that these performers were breaking the law by violating the masquerading ordinance, so she lost her liquor license. But incredibly, she sued the city of St. Louis to get it back. She didn't win in court, but it was still, in retrospect, a turning point in St. Louis's LGBTQI+ history. She later served time in federal prison because she continued serving liquor under the table, despite not having her liquor license. But what a fascinating character from St. Louis's queer history. George Hanna is another incredible character from St. Louis's queer history in the 1920s and 1930s. George grew up in rural Mississippi, but like so many other Black Americans of his generation, moved north to the big city of St. Louis during the Great Migration. Once he was here, he became a part of St. Louis's flourishing blues scene and cut some records for Paramount Records, a leading blues and jazz label of the era. Many of his songs deal overtly with queer themes. It's an incredible glimpse of queer life in Black St. Louis in the early 20th century. One of George's songs, The Boy in the Boat, even has a line that reads, "When you see two women walking hand in hand, just look 'em over, try to understand." Here we tell the story of an extraordinary Missourian named Helen Stevens. Helen grew up as a tomboy in Fulton, Missouri, in mid-Missouri, and from an early age showed an exceptional athletic ability. That athletic ability took her all the way to the Olympics in 1936 in Berlin, Germany. An infamous Olympics because Hitler was in charge in Germany at the time and used it as an opportunity to showcase his Nazi ideology. Now, Helen Stevens did very well at this Olympics, winning a gold medal for the 100-meter dash and a gold medal for being part of the women's relay team for the United States. So she gained international fame because of her athletic prowess, but also controversy. Helen was sort of masculine in her appearance and mannerisms, and rumors circulated and were reported on in the press that she was really a man, and she was forced to submit to humiliating tests to prove that she was a woman. Now, Helen was, in fact, a lesbian, a woman who loved women, and she had a girlfriend back at home in Missouri. And she would go on to spend the rest of her life in a long-term romantic relationship with a woman after she settled in St. Louis. So in this section of the exhibit, we have some amazing artifacts from Helen's time at the Olympics, including the cleats that she wore when she won the 100-meter dash. But we also have something else. She kept letters that she exchanged with her girlfriend from around the time of the Olympics and in the years afterward. And we compiled excerpts of those here in a flip book. So visitors are both able to see these extraordinary pieces speaking to Helen's international celebrity and fame as an athlete, and then also a part of her private life that she had to hide. This is the final part of the first chronological section of the exhibit. We talk about the Second World War, which was both a major turning point in American and world history, and also a turning point in the LGBTQIA+ experience. World War II was the first time that the US military explicitly barred homosexuals from serving, although many did in secret. We tell the World War II story through the lives of Helen Montgomery and Lucy Reinhardt. They were a couple who met during the Second World War while one was serving in the Women's Army Corps and another was in the USO. After the war, the two settled in the St. Louis area and had a long life together, although they mostly had to keep the relationship secret, telling many people that they were sisters instead of life partners. This is the start of the second chronological section of the exhibit, The Rise of a Movement. It covers a period from the 1950s through the 1990s, an era that saw an increasingly organized, visible, and political LGBTQIA+ community in the St. Louis area. This backdrop photo is from a landmark moment in that story, the 1980 celebration of lesbian and gay pride, often regarded as the first pride celebration in St. Louis's history. It ended with a rally on the steps of Brookings Hall on the campus of Washington University, which you can see here. This section begins with the discussion of the oppressive atmosphere that prevailed in the 1950s and 1960s. It was a time of shame and little visibility. However, despite that, community did form in places like bars, although they were often subject to raids, and Miss Fanny's Ball, St. Louis's longest-running drag ball, which began in the 1950s, and it has been an important site of LGBTQIA+ community building among African-American St. Louisans ever since. We also talk about softball, which was an important area for lesbian community in St. Louis during the 1950s and 1960s. And we have some amazing artifacts on display from the softball career of Betty Woods, who would go on to own Betty's CB Bar, an important lesbian gathering place in St. Louis. So this is the first of our Please Note sections, areas of the exhibit that were sort of set off from the main path, and we encourage visitors to make an informed choice about whether they wanted to experience it because of sensitive content. This is the part of the exhibit that deals most overtly with sex. Now, this is an important topic because sex between two men or two women was illegal in Missouri up until about the start of the 21st century, and that shaped LGBTQIA+ life here for generations. Here we talk about Masters and Johnson, St. Louis-based sex therapists who offer their clients the therapies that would allow homosexuals to become heterosexuals, or so they claimed, although those claims received significant criticism both from other scientists and gay activists. We also talk about Laud Humphreys, a St. Louis-based sociologist who, in the early 1960s, conducted pioneering research on men who had anonymous sex with other men in the public bathrooms in Forest Park. It was a groundbreaking study, but also one that was immensely controversial. Finally, we talk about the Coral Court Motel, which was an infamous site for rendezvous between both heterosexual and homosexual couples looking for a discreet place to meet. We also have a really amazing painting by James Riddle, a local artist, that depicts one of these trysts. Now the exhibit begins to explore how an organized movement for LGBTQIA+ rights emerged in the United States and in the St. Louis area. A crucial facet of this was the idea of coming out, that is, speaking openly about one's gender or sexual orientation with friends, family, or in the public in general. We tell the story of coming out through an extraordinary correspondence between Michael Shepley, a St. Louis teenager, and his father, Ethan Shepley. Michael, as a teenager, wrote to his father to tell him, "I am a homosexual." So we have that letter that Michael sent, and also his father's extraordinary and sympathetic response. Next, we have this timeline that traces the development of LGBTQIA+ activism in the United States and St. Louis from its origins as far back as the 1920s up through the end of the 1970s. We use icons to distinguish between local events and national events. And we cover many important turning points in this history, including the Stonewall Rebellion of 1969, St. Louis's own Stonewall moment when the Mandrake Society protested at police headquarters downtown in Halloween 1969, the founding of the local Metropolitan Community Church, and finally, the 1979 March on Washington. So, during these years, there wasn't only a political movement for LGBTQIA+ rights, there was also an increasingly cohesive and visible community. We talk about an array of LGBTQIA+ community organizations of the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s in this part of the exhibit. And we have many extraordinary artifacts that speak to those stories. We talk about identity-based groups like the Bisexual Alliance of St. Louis, arts and culture groups like Wired Women. We talk about the impact of the queer community on the Soulard Mardi Gras tradition, and also local businesses. A great example is the Sunshine Inn, which was a beloved restaurant and cafe in the Central West End. It was a community gathering place. We talk about athletics, like St. Louisans' participation in the Gay Games, and religious groups, like the Metropolitan Community Church of Greater St. Louis. And we close with a discussion of leather and motorcycle clubs. So, as many artifacts as we had in that last case, we knew that there were many other community organizations, both in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and afterwards, that we didn't include. Because of that, we invited visitors to create their own flyer at this interactive station. Visitors were told that they could make a flyer celebrating an organization or business that no longer exists, to talk about one that's around today, or to imagine one that they wish were here. And we've had many amazing responses, a rotating selection of which are displayed here. The 1970s and 1980s also saw in St. Louis a flourishing lesbian feminist community that sat at the intersection of the women's movement and the movement for LGBTQIA+ rights. In this area of the exhibit, we have some extraordinary artifacts and images that speak to their vibrant activism and community building. But one artifact that I especially want to point out is this journal. So this was a journal kept by a woman named Barb Getty. Barb Getty grew up in St. Louis in the 1950s and 1960s, and at the close of the 1960s started art school at Washington University. While she was there, she came out as a lesbian, which was a very difficult thing to do at the close of the 1960s. Then, during the 1970s, she was at the forefront of the local lesbian feminist community, serving as an illustrator for the locally published magazine Moonstorm, living in women's cooperative housing, and otherwise engaging in activism and community life. All through those years, she kept an amazing series of sketchbook journals. In these sketchbook journals, she not only recorded her day-to-day experiences, created an amazing record of the lesbian feminist community in St. Louis during those years, but being an artist, she also filled them with drawings, paintings, photographs, and mementos of her life. Fortunately, decades later, when she heard about the Gateway to Pride Collecting initiative, she donated all of these journals to the Missouri Historical Society. They're real treasures of the collection. So when our graphic designer was trying to decide what should the Gateway to Pride exhibit look like, she was inspired by those journals. So the entire exhibit is supposed to evoke the feeling of a scrapbook or a sketchbook. And our graphic designer also took some of those drawings from those journals and placed them in labels and wallpaper and other parts of the exhibit. So Barb Getty's journals really fill and inspire the rest of this exhibit. Now, this is a really fun part of the exhibit. It's all about the history of nightlife, lesbian and gay nightlife, in the St. Louis area during the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. During these years, a movement for LGBTQIA+ rights grew up alongside a vibrant local nightlife scene. So nightlife was about having fun, but it was also about community, about organizing, and about affirming one's identity. So we have some amazing artifacts from iconic St. Louis bars and nightclubs like Attitudes, Clementines, and More or Less. We also have a selection of images of matchbooks that were donated to the Gateway to Pride initiative from a wide array of lesbian and gay bars and nightclubs in the St. Louis area. And then we've mapped those establishments on a map of the St. Louis area to show where these bars were concentrated. Then we also discuss the drag scene in St. Louis. Here is our drag stage. We have costumes worn by 3 legendary local drag performers. And we also have a crown that one of them, Alexis Principal, won in a local drag pageant. Finally, we have our drag stage, but we also have the backstage area over here. It's a drag dressing room with some more artifacts that local drag queens used to prepare to get on stage. So we have this amazing look at nightlife and drag in the St. Louis area during these crucial decades. This part of the exhibit explores the history of Pride celebrations in the St. Louis area. Pride began in 1970 as a commemoration of the first anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion of June 1969, and ever since, Pride has been an important part of queer culture across the world. St. Louis's history of Pride celebrations go back to the 1970s, and they've been held annually since 1979 or 1980, depending on who you ask. We have some extraordinary artifacts that speak to the history of Pride in the St. Louis area, including a t-shirt from the historic 1980 celebration of lesbian and gay pride, a banner from an early Black Pride festival when it was still called the B-Boy Festival, and a trophy that was awarded for Best Float at the 2009 Pride Parade on Grand Avenue in St. Louis. So this is the second half of our politics and activism timeline. We already saw the first half earlier. That covered the 1920s through the 1970s. This one covers the 1980s and 1990s. It starts with this Dyke license plate, which local activist Lisa Wagaman managed to convince the Missouri Department of Revenue to issue her in 1983. As we go on, we see other landmark events in the history of LGBTQI+ activism in St. Louis and around the country during these years, including the 1987 and 1993 marches on Washington, the murder of Matthew Shepard, and the Supreme Court decision Lawrence v. Texas, which legalized sex between 2 men or 2 women nationwide. This part of the exhibit is called Struggles for Change. It deals with how lesbian and gay rights became an increasingly contentious issue in American politics and civic and cultural life in the 1980s and 1990s. There are artifacts that speak to local organizations like the Privacy Rights Education Project and Queer Nation. And we have this amazing piece that was worn by Michelle McCausland. Offstage, Michelle was known as Michael Shreves. She was a very talented and popular local drag performer, but what really makes her historic is that she was one of the plaintiffs in the case in the 1980s that overturned St. Louis's masquerading ordinance. Argued by local lesbian feminist attorney Arlene Zaremka, that was a tremendous victory for the local LGBTQIA+ movement. We also tell the story of Rodney Wilson, a social studies teacher in South St. Louis County who in the early 1990s came out to his class as gay, causing national controversy, and also originated the idea of LGBT History Month, still celebrated every October. The final part of the second chronological section deals with the AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 1990s. The AIDS crisis was devastating for the LGBTQI+ community, both in the St. Louis area and around the world, but the community also organized to respond to the crisis and came together. So in this area, we have some amazing artifacts, including some pieces from the Ezekiel Project AIDS Memorial Altar that was at the Metropolitan Community Church, a scarf worn by actor Michael Cairns during his performances of Intimacies, a set of monologues that explored the AIDS crisis, and a t-shirt from Blacks Assisting Blacks Against AIDS. There's also a panel with some images that speak to local AIDS service organizations like St. Louis Effort for AIDS, Food Outreach, and Doorways. This is another part of the exhibit that deals with the AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 1990s. It's also another one of our Please Note sections because it deals with some particularly sensitive content, two extraordinary artifacts that speak to the anguish and sorrow associated with AIDS. We tried to make this a quiet, reflective space. So the first of these artifacts is the ACT UP coffin. ACT UP was a direct action organization with chapters all around the world, founded in the late 1980s. Members of ACT UP used nonviolent civil disobedience and disruptive protest to raise awareness about the AIDS crisis and to demand a more urgent response to the crisis. There was a chapter in St. Louis called ACT UP St. Louis, and one member of that chapter was Greg Gerhardt. He created this coffin out of foam core and duct tape and spray paint. The coffin was used in local demonstrations. Now, what makes this coffin really extraordinary is that it's more than just a piece of protest art. Dennis Chambers, a close friend of Greg Gerhardt and a fellow member of ACT UP St. Louis, passed away of AIDS-related complications in 1995. Afterwards, Greg took one of Dennis's hospital vans that he had saved and put it inside of the coffin. He said that doing so turned the coffin into a memorial for everyone who was lost. Later, our conservator, when she was preparing the coffin for display, confirmed that that hospital band was still inside. Also, we have this absolutely amazing and heart-wrenching artifact. If you look closely, you see that this piece is made out of pills. It was created by a local artist named Michael David Zimmer, who in 1993 was dying of AIDS. He despaired of ever getting better and decided to use his remaining supply of medication to create his last piece of artwork. He used it to create a sort of mosaic that asks, why do AIDS drugs kill? I think like nothing else, this piece captures the sorrow of someone facing AIDS at this chapter in history. The area of the exhibit with the ACT UP coffin and the AZT mosaic piece is also where we have another visitor response interactive. We were inspired by the candlelight memorials that were often held for victims of the AIDS crisis in the late 1980s and 1990s. So we invite visitors to fill in one of these paper flames with the names of someone that they cared about who was lost to AIDS, and we display a rotating selection here. There have been many responses that tug at your heartstrings. We're entering our third and final chronological section titled Equality ? And that question mark is very important. This section deals with the recent past, the 21st century. Sometimes people think it might be a little strange to think of the past couple of decades as history, But it's been a time of really dramatic historical change. This is an era when there have been great victories for the LGBTQIA+ movement, marriage equality, open military service for gays and lesbians, heightened level of cultural visibility and acceptance. But it's also been a time of ongoing controversy. So we explore all of that here. This backdrop image is of a 2019 Pride Parade in downtown St. Louis with a diverse and colorful group of marchers under the Gateway Arch. This first area of the Lionel chronological section deals with political groundbreakers in the LGBTQIA+ community. Openly LGBTQIA+ elected officials were a powerful symbol of increasing acceptance for queer people in the broader community. So we explore that history here. We talk about Tim Cusick, the first openly gay man to run for elected office in the St. Louis area. He didn't win at first, but it was still a pivotal moment. Then we talk about openly queer legislators like Jeanette Mott Oxford and Tom Hannigan, as well as Shane Cohn, an openly gay member of the St. Louis Board of Aldermen. Then we shift gears and talk about another topic that has to do with government and politics, but a little different: open military service. So for a long time, it was against regulations for openly queer people to serve in the US military. That had a huge impact on the LGBTQI+ community, but for many years, activists pushed to change that. Finally, in 2011, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. That allowed openly gay men, lesbians, and bisexual people to serve in the US military. We tell that story through a St. Louisan, Steve Zeiger, who was born in the Metro East, served in the military in the closet, and then after Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, and he retired from the military, became a very public advocate for LGBTQIA+ service members and veterans. So here's one of his uniforms from his time in the US Air Force. We also talk about Laura Ann Moore, who is a prominent social justice advocate and lesbian feminist activist in St. Louis for many years. In the early 1990s, she was appointed by Mayor Freeman Bosley Jr. to the Civil Rights Commission, making her the first openly LGBTQIA+ city official in St. Louis. This next area of the exhibit is called Victories for Visibility. It's all about the increasing visibility and acceptance of openly LGBTQIA+ people in a wide array of cultural fields in the St. Louis area in the early 21st century. We talk about groundbreakers like openly gay professional football player Michael Sam, local organizations like Big Crank Cycling, same-sex ballroom dancers Sonia Faria and Ann Taylor. Finally, we have vestments worn by Bishop Wyatt I. Greenlee, who headed the LGBTQIA+ affirming, predominantly Black, Glory to Glory Christian Church. This section of the exhibit deals with the struggle for marriage equality, one of the most important historical developments in American LGBTQIA+ history. So it's incredible to think that as recently as the year 2000, there was no legal jurisdiction in the entire world that recognized marriage between two men or two women. But by 2015, same-sex marriage had been legalized across the entire United States. So we trace how that incredible story played out in St. Louis here. We have some amazing artifacts, including wedding dresses worn by a local same-sex couple who celebrated their holy union at Trinity Episcopal Church in the early 1990s, before same-sex marriage was legal in Missouri. That shows that even before there was an option to pursue legal marriage, many same-sex couples did celebrate marriage ceremonies. We also have another set of wedding clothes. These belonged to Scott Emanuel and Ed Reggie. They have an incredible story too. In 2009, the state of Iowa's Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage there in the state of Iowa. And for the first time, there was a state bordering Missouri in the Midwest where same-sex marriage was legal. Ed and Scott were a couple in St. Louis who had been together for about 10 years, and they decided that they wanted to take advantage of that development to gain some legal recognition for their union. They soon discovered that there were many other couples in a similar situation who wanted to join them, so they decided to rent a bus. And the Show Me Equality Marriage Bus was born. Over the following years, there were several other bus trips that brought many other couples from the St. Louis area to Iowa to obtain legal recognition of their relationship. So we have the clothes that Ed and Scott wore at their wedding there behind us. We also have this timeline that traces major developments globally, nationally, and in the St. Louis area, documenting the struggle for marriage equality, ending with the US Supreme Court decision that legalized it both in Missouri and across the country. But in this section, we also wanted to think not just about marriage, but more broadly about the idea of family. So we have this flip book here. It's sort of a family photo album for St. Louis. We included pictures of families not only from the collections of the Missouri Historical Society from past decades, but we also asked community members to submit their own photos of what their families look like today. So it shows the incredible diversity of LGBTQIA+ families and other sorts of families in the St. Louis region over the years and today. This next area of the exhibit explores contemporary transgender activism. People we would think of today as transgender have always been part of St. Louis's story, but it's really only been in the past decade or two that there's been a more organized, visible, specifically transgender movement. In this section of the exhibit, we talk about some really important local transgender organizations of recent years, like Trans Parent, which advocated for the parents of transgender children, and the Metro Trans Umbrella Group. We have some t-shirts from the Metro Trans Umbrella Group on display. But beyond that, we also have a really fun and interesting artifact that speaks to transgender community. It's called the TG, or Transgender Ken doll. So this was a sort of unique homemade creation. They took a Ken doll's head and put it on a Barbie doll's body, and also gave it a paper crown. Now, this piece was used in a special way by a group of transgender women friends who every year went to Eureka Springs, Arkansas, a sort of little island of queer visibility in the Ozarks, to celebrate their annual getaway. This was a chance for many of them, who are sometimes closeted in their public lives, to live openly and proudly as transgender women, at least for a weekend. And it was normally held around Halloween, and there was always a costume contest. And the winner of the costume contest got to have the TG Ken doll for the year. We've moved into another one of the sections of the exhibit with a please note label because of particularly sensitive content. This area of the exhibit explores anti-LGBTQIA+ violence in recent years and the ways that the community has responded to that violence. We have some really powerful artifacts that speak to that, including a painting done in memory of the victims of the Pulse Massacre in Orlando, Florida, by a member of the St. Louis LGBTQIA+ community. We also have another spectacular artifact, the Transgender Memorial Flag, something that I think really powerfully speaks to the toll that anti-LGBTQIA+ violence has taken on the community. The story behind this artifact is that a young transgender woman in St. Louis in 2016 was really moved by stories of the violence facing her community, both hate crimes and also self-harm and suicide. So, to memorialize the victims of that violence, she took a transgender pride flag and, using a marker, began to inscribe the names of transgender victims of violence. She continued to write more names as she heard of them, and then she brought that flag to protest and demonstrations and annual Transgender Day of Remembrance ceremonies. Then she donated that flag to the Missouri Historical Society. It's such a powerful piece. But when the donor gave us the flag, she asked, if there are more victims of violence, can you add their names to the artifact? We explained that we weren't able to do that we try to preserve the artifacts just as they were when we received them. But we decided to give visitors a chance to engage with that idea of remembering those lost too soon and to honor victims of violence. So we created this interactive piece. It's a memorial loom. Visitors are invited to take one of these pieces of fabric and to weave them into the loom, creating a collective work of art that memorializes victims of violence and honors the lives of everyone in the LGBTQI+ community. So this is the end of the final chronological section of the exhibit. It deals with the changing role of LGBTQI+ community spaces in recent years. People both are afraid that many lesbian and gay bars and nightclubs are closing and wondering what that means for the community, as they were so central as gathering spaces over so many generations. But at the same time, the rise of the internet is transforming how LGBTQI+ people connect with one another and build community. So we explore all of that here. We have some incredible artifacts from recently closed LGBTQI+ gathering places in St. Louis, like Attitudes and JJ's, and Coffee Cartel too. And then we explore the impact of the internet with some really interesting artifacts like a computer from the 1990s era LGBT Center in St. Louis. And then this piece here, a first-generation iPhone, which a lot of people think is strange to see in a history museum, but when you think about it, smartphones really have transformed our lives in so many ways, and they've had special implications for the LGBTQI+ community. This particular first-generation iPhone was owned by a young man from the St. Louis area named David J. When he was a teenager in St. Louis, David J. realized that he was asexual, that is, he doesn't experience sexual attraction. And he knew that there were very few people like him, or so he thought. But then he created a website called the Asexual Visibility and Education Network. And quickly he discovered that there were actually many other people across the country and world who felt like him. So that's an incredible example of how the internet can be a vehicle for community building for people in the LGBTQI+ community, in this case, the asexual. We've reached the close of the exhibit, and the way that we end the exhibit is by exploring contemporary creative expression. Some of the ways that LGBTQI+ St. Louisans today are expressing themselves and celebrating the beauty and vibrancy and resilience of the queer community. So we explore that through many different mediums. We have a video piece, which we actually borrowed from Channel 9, that explores the ballroom scene in St. Louis. We have some paintings by local artist Hannah Stewart, and headdresses that were created and worn on stage by Maxi Glamour, a well-known local drag artist. We even have a poem by a local writer, Mary Maxfield, and a selection of really striking portrait photographs by Jess Dugan, a local photographer, of members of the local LGBTQIA+ community. And then the exhibit comes to a close with this quotation from an oral history interview I recorded with Colin Murphy. Colin Murphy was a successful and prominent LGBTQIA+ journalist in St. Louis from the 1990s until the start of the 2020s. His oral history was a fascinating look at some momentous years in St. Louis's LGBTQIA+ history. Very sadly, he died of cancer before the exhibit opened. But I think this quotation from his interview really captures the spirit of the exhibit and was the message that I wanted to leave visitors with as they left. It's just generational efforts, passing the baton, and each generation doing their part. I think the Martin Luther King quote that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, is very much correct. But it takes all of us working together, everyone using their talents, everyone playing their own part, no matter how large or how small, that helps bend that arc and keep it on its trajectory.